Delighted to introduce Dr. Julien Mirivel. Dr. Mirivel is a professor of applied application communication. He's an author and a professional speaker. I actually discovered him through one of his TEDx, wonderful TEDx speaking recordings. And Dr. Mirivel has delivered hundreds of keynotes, trainings, and workshops on how to communicate effectively. His mission is to inspire individuals and groups to communicate more positively at work and at home. Originally from Paris, France, he's among the founding scholars in the emerging field of positive communication. Dr. Mirivel has published in the most rigorous journals in the field of communication, and he's the author of 2 books on positive communication. His next book, Positive Communication for Leaders, Proven Strategies for Inspiring Unity and Effective Change, will be available in 2023. Dr. Mirivel, I'm so delighted that you're here with us, and I'd like to turn to you now, please.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I know I cannot see you, but it's good to spend the morning with you. I'm going to share my screen with you just to get started, and then we're going to hopefully do something meaningful together. So here it comes. Let me make sure I'm all set up here. There it is. And here's our slideshow. If there's any issues, please do let me know. We can stop at any time. So a couple years ago, in 2019, I partnered with Heifer International, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to end hunger around the world. And we've been partnering to do some research on personal transformation, studying mostly how women are partnering with Heifer to end hunger in their own lives and the lives of their communities. And so I traveled all the way to Nepal with a group of people, and we visited 10 different communities spanning 20 years of community development work. And as we were moving from group to group, I had the great chance of meeting people all across Nepal. And so I like to start all of my talks, anytime I do a training, with a bit of a ritual that draws on that experience. Imagine that you were joining me on this adventure and you were meeting all of the women who have been working so hard to rise out of poverty and create positive change in their own lives and their families and in their village. And they're all welcoming you, kind of like in this picture here, to their group, to their self-help group, to their community. And it's your first time in Nepal. And the question would be, how would you start this interaction? How would you, what would you say to them? If you were in Nepal, you would try to hopefully not just say hello in English or in your native tongue, but you would try to move in that direction and say hello in the native language. So we're going to practice today as if you were traveling to Nepal with me and saying hello to this wonderful group of women all around this community. And the greeting is namaste. Some of you may be familiar with it, but if you're not, here's what we're going to do. You're going to put your hands together. I know we can't see each other. It's so much more powerful when we can, but you're going to put your hands together. You're going to make eye contact with us or think of somebody who is on this chat room. And all I want you to do is bow slightly and say and utter the words namaste to the rest of the group. As you can see in this picture, that's what they're doing, namaste. It's such a beautiful greeting. Namaste means I see the light in you. I see the part of you that has character. I see the part of you that has integrity. And I welcome this interaction with that understanding. So the point for our session today is namaste. I see the light in you. And I welcome this interaction and this conversation with you with that understanding. One of my favorite research studies was done at Harvard. It's called the Harvard Grant Study. And what these researchers did is 75 years ago, they decided that they would follow 261 participants for the rest of their lives. Not kind of in a creepy way, but that they would study them. You know, they did interviews with them very often every 5 years throughout their lives. They did in-depth surveys with them. They sometimes even did family therapy with some of these participants. So they took 261 participants, aged 20 to 22, and they literally followed them for the rest of their lives. They followed them through their 20s. They followed them through their 30s. They followed them through their 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. The project is still undergoing as they're continuing to study these individuals. So at the time, a couple of years ago, George Valiant, who was at the time the director of the Harvard Grant Study, was interviewed because he wrote a beautiful book called Triumphs of Experience. And in that book, he summarizes some of the findings from all of the research that they've been doing for over 75 years. And so the interviewer asked him, he said, so, okay, what are you learning from collecting all of these data? I mean, you've been measuring how many alcoholic beverages people consume throughout their lifespan. You've been doing in-depth interviews and survey research. What's the top takeaways here? And George Valiant did not hesitate. This is what he said. He said, the only thing that matters in life are your relationships with other people. The only thing that matters in life are your relationships with other people. And I think a lot of us, when we see this statement, we know that it's obviously true. What matters to us is the relationships that we have with other people. A lot of us want to be able to create a meaningful romantic relationship with someone with whom we share our lives. A lot of us want to have meaningful friendships that connects us to people. A lot of us, and this is going to be the focus of our talk, want to work in a place where we feel valued, where we feel respected, where we can thrive. So it's a kind of a fact that we have these fundamental needs. But the problem is we may not always know how to create those relationships or how to create the kind of workplace that will allow people to feel valued, to feel respected, and to feel like they can thrive in that environment. So in today's talk, I'm going to try to show you ways of creating relationships with one another in a way that will hopefully create an environment where everyone feels valued, respected, included, and a place where people can thrive. And I believe that communication is at the heart of that. So that's what we're going to focus on. My quick story is this. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Julien Mirivel. I am a professor here at the university, but my journey began a long time ago in 1994. I was obviously born in Paris, France in the 70s. And in 1994, I really wanted to study English. So I flew at the time, my parents lived in Switzerland. So I flew from Geneva and landed as a foreign exchange student who was 15 in what was at the time, or seemed like at the time, the middle of nowhere. It's formerly called Iowa. I landed in Iowa. I was picked up by a host family, and I stayed 12 months. And I faced some of the most difficult times in my life because I spoke literally zero English. So just imagine this 15-year-old in the middle of Iowa who doesn't speak a word of English. And for 6 months, I experienced something very powerful, a total sense of isolation. I felt mute. I felt deaf. It's like I couldn't interact with people. And because of that, I was totally isolated. But that experience taught me something that now has been at the heart of what I teach to people about communication, which is quite simple. As I learned the language, as I learned to express myself and to understand and to interact with people in a new language, suddenly I started to be able to create connections with people. It was actually communication that set me free. So I really fell in love with American culture. I did that year. I met some great friends. And in fact, at the end of that year, one of my best friends said, if you want to continue your studies here, you can live with me and my family. And so I came back for a second year. I finished high school. Then I went to the University of Northern Iowa, where I fell in love with the study of communication. And it's been my passion, honestly, ever since. So I have a bachelor's degree in communication studies, a master's degree in communication studies, a PhD in communication studies from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I've been a faculty here at UA Little Rock for 18 years, where I've served also in a number of roles. I've been a dean of a college of 1,600 students, a chair, an associate dean. And so I've got both the kind of theoretical experience, but the practical experience of being a leader and managing people and working with them and create great teams. So I'm going to draw on this energy, hopefully, to try to share with you what I think is valuable about communication. Something else happened. So when I came to UA Little Rock, I joined a department that was very unusual. I had studied with some of the best minds in my field at CU Boulder at the time. And I came here and I saw people, my colleagues, who were not only great teachers, but they were living the life of great communication. It was so inspiring to me that I started to change the kind of research that I did. And I want to share with you what I started doing. So here's what happened. As I watched these people really be transformative teachers and transformative people, I started to ask myself some new questions about communication, and they sounded like this. The question number one was, what communication behaviors exemplify our best? What do people do when they exemplify their potential? You know, in all of us, there's what we do, and there's what we could do, or what we could become. And I'm very interested in, what do we do when we communicate at our best, at our peak? My second question became, what are some small actions that make a difference at work and at home? So are there small things that we know of that people do, whether it's in the workplace or at home, that actually make a difference? So I wanted to know, what do the best teachers do when they get in the classroom? What do the best managers do when they work with people? What are the essential characteristics of great teams? Or also, you know, how do we cultivate a meaningful friendship? So I started to look for trying to answer these big questions. And the third question was, what are some communication behaviors that can create a butterfly effect? So a butterfly effect is a simple concept that came from a meteorologist, and it sounds like this. Does the flapping of a butterfly in Japan affect a tornado in Texas? And the answer is, it does. Now, I have no idea how that works, so please don't put that in the Q&A because I don't know how that works. But what I am interested in is, are there things that we can do, you can do? There's 115 of us here in this room, that little communication behavior, simple things we can do that would have a butterfly effect, that would have some consequence just beyond the move and beyond ourselves. So in trying to answer these questions, I've honestly done a lot of work and research, studying both the nature of positive communication practices, which is what we're going to focus on, effective communication, also ethical communication. As Leanne mentioned, I've written a couple books, one on the art of positive communication, and in 2023, we're releasing a new book with a colleague of mine called Positive Communication for Leaders. And today's talk is going to focus mostly on this idea of how can you practice positive communication as a leader within your organization. As a result of playing with all these ideas, I came up with this model that's going to ground our talk today. And I want to share with you briefly, and then we're going to unpack it. So the model looks like this. It's a model it's a practical model that's designed to emphasize 6 simple behaviors, things that are controllable, that you can do something about, that will help you not only create a revolution in the way you interact with other people, but that's going to help you lead others effectively and hopefully create a great environment in your workplace. The behaviors and principles come together. So the model begins on top. First, I believe that when people are willing to greet and invite connection, that they can create human contact. I believe that when people ask what we'll discuss as open-ended questions, that you have the opportunity to discover the unknown. I believe that when you compliment and use communication in that way, that you can affect people, both who people are in the moment, but also more importantly, who they become. The fourth behavior is about disclosure, which is revealing yourself. So in the model, I propose that when we disclose authentically, genuinely, that we have the ability and the power to deepen the connections that we have with other people, to deepen our relationships. The fifth principle is about the power of encouragement. I argue in the model that when we encourage, we have the ability to give what the scholars call social support, right? We get to support one another. We can use communication as a gift. And the last behavior is the act of listening. And I believe that when we listen deeply and genuinely, that we can transcend the perceived differences that exist between you and other people. So here are 6 behaviors that I believe are the heart of not just positive communication, but also positive leadership, that when you start to interact in these ways, you have the ability to both inspire and positively influence the environment around you. There goes the butterfly effect. You're going to create a revolution in the way you interact, which is going to create a revolution in your relationships, which is going to create a revolution in your workplaces, and hopefully also in your communities and in the world at large. So in this talk, we're going to draw on this model, and I'm going to unpack it piece by piece. So by the end of this hour that we have together with some Q&A, you'll know how to put it into action. I want to make this very practical for you. I do come with a bit of an argument or proposition. And the proposition is this: When you choose to practice positive communication, it's going to help you grow as a person and as a professional. It's going to stretch your boundaries, just like coming to the United States at 15 stretched my boundaries. It's going to help you create what we call in the literature high quality connections or high quality relationships, which are crucial, by the way, for a positive workplace environment. And then hopefully it's going to help you build a positive culture across an organization that is so powerful in creating positive change in people's lives. So let's use the time that we have together to unpack this piece by piece so that you know how to apply the model in your own life. Here's the first part. So the first part is about really the power of greetings, but you'll notice here the principle says greetings allow us to create human connection. The word create is actually really important because in most people's minds, communication is simply a mode of transmission, meaning we think that communication is this. I have an idea in my brain. I have something to say. I'm going to express it, and then I've done my job. I'm done, right? And we do this with email, and we do this with our thoughts, and we do this on our social media. We think communication is simply a way of transmitting information. And we have a lot of metaphors that help us talk about communication in this way. But one of the most important paradigm shifts in my academic discipline is a movement away from transmission towards what we call the constitutive view of communication. I know it's a little technical, but essentially it means that when we communicate, we are not just transmitting information, we are creating the very reality of who we are, our relationships, our team, our community, our workplaces. It's all being done in that one moment when interaction is being done. I kind of want you to feel this for a second. I know it's hard, we can't see each other. So I'm going to try a bit of an experiment here that's only natural. So I'm going to do it this way. So imagine that I'm giving you a quick task here. I would like for you to create a moment of connection with someone who is part of this group. There's 129 of us currently. Okay. You can do anything you want to create that connection, to create that friendship. But I only have one rule. And the rule is you cannot communicate. So I don't know if Karen is able to do this for a second, but you cannot use the Q&A. You cannot use the chat. And in fact, I'm going to come out of here for a second, and we're going to all shut down our videos for a second. We cannot communicate. Shut down your video for a second. And then I'm also going to shut down and mute myself for just a moment. So try to do anything you can to connect with other people and build a relationship with them. I see we've got people who've been creative. They raised their hands. There's 3 participants who raised their hands. If you raise your hands, you are communicating. If I take away all your tools, if I take away your eyes, if I take away touch, if I take away your voice, if I take away the ability to raise your hand or to chat, if I take away communication, you cannot relate. It's impossible. But the more important lesson for this talk is actually the opposite, which is, of course, without communication, you cannot relate. But what I want you to really understand is that communication is unavoidable. So because it's unavoidable, you can't change the way you move, you can't change the way you make eye contact, that when you communicate, you are inherently doing the world of relationship. Communication is relationship. Communication creates relationship. That's the key part of this first piece of the model. So the behavior of greeting is actually important because greeting is the first move we make to move in the direction of connection, right? It's so crucial. Like I did an interview with one of my good friends and colleagues, Arvind Singhal, who does community development work around the world. He's at UT El Paso. And when I interviewed him, this is what he said to me. He's a communication professor. He says, if I say hello to my friend Julien and the quality of our interaction is good, then that relationship will continue. It's evolving, cascading, energizing potentiality that you seed when you make that first encounter. So I like to talk to people about greetings because it's the first opening to connection. It's also the first to disappear. So one of my first administrative job was I was hired to be chair of a department where people were totally divided. It was like a hostile workplace environment. And my task was to bring people back together and try to do it in 18 months, which we did successfully. But the first sign that I knew this was really pretty terrible is I walked down the hallway and people refused to say hi to each other. It was so bad that some people took the stairway at the end of the hall so they would avoid one another on their way out. Greetings is the first thing to disappear. But it's really critical in business. I'll give you another example. This is called the New Zealand Language at Work project. It's been being done now for decades. It started at the University of Wellington. And here's what the researchers did. They took 8 different workplaces and they put audio recorders everywhere. And they start recording all the conversations that people have at work. It's really fascinating research. So thousands of hours of talk, 8 different workplaces. One of the key things from all that research was this. Those little conversations we have, like, how's your weekend? What are you up to? What do you do for fun? All those little conversations actually is what creates collegiality, which is why in today's world with Zoom, people are feeling more and more disconnected because we're losing this ability to do small talk, right? When I was a master's student, I studied pre-meeting talk, which is all the talk that happens before meetings. When people were gathering together, they had a lot of that. They would joke, they would share stories. But now when we Zoom, we go straight to the task. The New Zealand Language at Work project did something else. So they started to look at 2 companies. One, really great culture where people got along, celebrated birthdays, people were retained. And then they looked at a company where that was not the case, problematic organization. And they looked at a bunch of variables, but at some point, one researcher said, hey, let's look at email communication. So they took 500 emails here. They took 500 emails in the other group, and they started comparing them. And they found something really striking. In the organization where people had a negative culture, people emailed each other in this way. The meeting is at 5, John. The reports are due in 2 weeks, Stacy. In the company where people got along, their emails were almost about the same content, right? The same information, but the way they were doing it was very different. Just listen to the difference. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a good week. Remember that we have a meeting this Friday at 5 o'clock. Looking forward to seeing you there, Julien. Or, hey, everyone, or hey, team. I know you've been working on reports for the last couple of weeks. Please remember, remember that the reports are due in 2 weeks from today. I can't wait to look at the hard work that you've been putting into those. Warm regards, Stacy. Do you see that the content is the same, right? Communication is not transmitting information, though. When we communicate, we create our relationship. And what the New Zealand Language at Work project found is that when you change the way you email, you change the kind of culture you create. So I told you I would make this very practical. What can you do with this piece of the model? Well, I'm going to give you some ideas here. Here's some things you can work on. Within this organization, there's 133 of us today. Try to initiate contact with 3 new stakeholders that you don't know very well and initiate a coffee or initiate a quick Zoom. The great thing about Zoom is we get to connect with people in new ways, right? So make that one of your top tasks out of this talk is connect with 3 people in a new way and take the time to do that. Second is use warm openings and endings in emails. The New Zealand Language at Work project is very clear. Those practices really matter for creating connection. Third layer comes from a book that I really like on what the great teams do. And the author talks about establishing belongingness cues. So people have to know that they belong, that they're connected. And there's really 3 ways of doing that. One is you invest energy in the exchange. When people are with you, you're totally with them. You're totally focused on them. You treat each person as unique and valued. So you're not kind of treating each other impersonally. You're treating each other very personally. And then third, and very important, is you signal that the relationship will always continue. So if you can't finish an encounter, you might say something like, hey, I know I can't finish this conversation right now, but let's grab coffee tomorrow. And then maybe you follow through on that. Or let's Zoom in a couple of weeks and connect. Or if you have a conflict, then you let people know that the conversation in the relationship is still in a safe place. If you want to brainstorm, which I hope you might do at some point, is try to create some practices that will help invite conversation. Like one of my favorite when I was dean is I had about 1,600 students in the college, and I was trying to find ways of connecting people. And an easy way was I created what was called the monthly student lunch with the dean. So I took students from different academic disciplines, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and I fed them lunch because a lot of our students struggle with food insecurity. So I didn't want that to be a problem. And then all I did for an hour was just ask people to introduce themselves and connect. And suddenly we had students from criminal justice, meeting students from communication, and students from sociology, meeting students from psychology, and they were able to connect. You know, greetings are so powerful that I think it's at the heart of transformation. And I'm starting to document this. So in my work with Heifer International, we have studied mostly women across both India, Uganda, and now we're going to go to South America, in the way that self-help groups help support them. And one of the things that participants have talked about is the way they've changed their grading. So I put some quotes here for today. You know, Manny, who was interviewed for the project, said, my way of greeting has changed. Now I greet people in a more sophisticated way. And Girja said, I perceive people more positively. I will introduce myself. I'm the one initiating and ask them for their introduction. And then we'll invite them to my house and treat them in a friendly manner. There's a huge movement towards being intentional, but also being the initiator of the interaction. My good friend Tom Soha, who is an expert on positive communication, told me this when I wrote a book about some of the best communication professors in my discipline. He said, when you greet, you invite, and I think that's fundamentally important. So that's the first part of the model. The second part of the model is about the power of questions. In the model, I propose that when we ask questions, we have the ability to discover what we do not know. Again, for my second book, I interviewed some of the best communication professors in my discipline, people who had been in the discipline for at least 30 years, who had made major contributions. One of those people is Jerry Philipson. And Jerry Philipson told me, he said this, he said, Julien, there's probably no communicative form more valuable to you than the question. The question is the variable that makes the difference. Why would a communication professor tell us that that's the most significant behavior? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of them is if you look inside the word question is the word quest. So when we are interacting and we start the behavior of asking questions, we're actually opening the door to something. We're going on a quest. We're putting ourselves in a position of discovery. But unfortunately, not all questions proceed in this way. So in my discipline, we make a very simple distinction. You're probably familiar, but it's so vital. There are some questions that are narrowing and controlling interaction. We call those close-ended. And there are some questions that are there to expand and give freedom. And we call those open-ended. So I know I don't have a lot of people here, but maybe Leanne can help me for a second here with some audio. Leanne, if I just ask the question, do you like the color blue or yellow?
I prefer yellow.
All right. So you can see it's a very simple interaction. Thanks, Leanne. But the question is so powerful that what it does is it set in motion what the next person is going to tell you next, right? You notice that? Of all the things Leanne could tell me, all the things I could discover about her, I have zoomed it down to two choices, blue or yellow. And she said, I preferred yellow. So she played along with the game. Those are what we call close-ended questions. And in my experience, we're very good at those because we're very good at controlling interaction. What we're now so good at is opening it up. Let me give you some examples. So I call this learning to flip your questions. So imagine that on Monday morning, you're coming into your office and you're working with your team. And it's very tempting. I used to do this too, where I'm walking down the hallway and I'm like, hey, did you have a good weekend? But really, I just keep moving forward, right? you have a good weekend? And I hear, yay, no, okay, but I really don't care. I'm moving forward. I got work to do. We do this all the time. What if in that one moment, instead of asking, did you have a good weekend? Instead, you would ask, what did you do this weekend? If you flip the questions and you make it a little bit more open-ended, you're going to open up the interaction inherently. Now, you can argue, I don't have time to do this. That's okay. But what I would tell you is if you change the question, you will change what you get. And if you change what you get, you're going to change the relationship. Or what about the annual review process? You know, when we evaluate people, it's very tempting for organizations, supervisors and managers to say, did you have a good year? Yeah. Okay. Now I've got feedback for you. Here's some things I need you to work on. But organizations today are changing this. So I've worked with one here in Little Rock that became well known for creating an unbelievable culture. In fact, they received some awards several years running. I interviewed the vice president of human resources to ask him, so what have you guys been doing to change this culture? And he says, you know, it's a lot of commitment. We really wanted to make the workplace our primary focus and the culture our primary focus. And he says, one of the things we changed to do this, very powerful, is we changed the questions we asked during the annual review process. Instead of asking, did you have a good year? We asked this: what can we do to help you reach your potential? What strength do you have that we can tap into this upcoming year? How can we serve you better this year? What are some professional development opportunities that you want to develop and grow within this company? And they started listening to their stakeholders, their employees. And of course, retention went up, and then they created the positive culture that they want to. But what about, you know, even community development work? It's very tempting when we go and do nonprofit work to say, do you need help? And then to provide that help. If the answer is yes, we provide the help, whether that's funding, etc. But I like the story of Heifer International, mostly because they flip the question. They don't ask, do you need help? They ask, what are your dreams and what are your hopes? If you ever have time, check out this story. I won't be able to tell you too much about it, but check out the story of Terai Trent. She has a TEDx talk, and she is originally from Zimbabwe, comes from a very poor village. And at the time that she was about 17 years old, she had 3 children. She was obviously married very young and really did not have a future. At the time, Joe Luck, who was working for Heifer International, was visiting the village in Zimbabwe to try to get some community partnership formed. So she was sitting in a circle. You can find some of these pictures online. And Terai talks about this in her TEDx talk, actually. And Joe Luck met with her. And at the end, Terai had said nothing. There were 10, 12 women together meeting with Joe, and they had said nothing. She had said nothing. So Joe Luck turned to her and said, Terai, you have not said anything. What are your dreams? What are your hopes? And in her TEDx talk, Terai said, I don't know how I had the courage to share this with the group here, but I ended up telling people, I want to get an education. I want to get a bachelor's degree. I want to get a master's degree, and I want to get a PhD. And sure enough, from that day, she talked to her mom. She buried her dreams in the ground to follow some local customs. And she went on this journey of transformation. And if you watch the TEDx talk, not only did she move to the United States, she earned her GED in 7 years. She moved to the United States to get a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a PhD. She worked for Heifer for a couple of years, and then also received a gift from Oprah to start over $1 million to start schools in Zimbabwe to benefit young girls. A lot of lessons in that story, but what's beautiful, at least an aspect that I enjoy, is this little moment where Joe is asking, what are your dreams and what are your hopes? So to me, that's the power of opening up questions. How can you apply that in your everyday life right now? Here's some examples. I told you I would try to make this practical. Use the power of questions to at least do 4 things. Discover your employees and discover members of your team. Ask questions that will help you understand where they're coming from. Simple questions like, what do you like to do for fun? Or what are some things that you need to thrive? Take the time to incorporate these questions when you meet with people in your one-on-ones, in your weekly meetings. Give people voice. You know, when you have an opportunity to include people, questions are a powerful way of getting people involved. Here's the outcome I want, you might say, as a leader. How can we get there? Or what do you think we should do? Here's the problem. What do you think we should do? These are easy ways of getting people to share their knowledge and their expertise. Find ways of opening up your meetings, especially if you're doing a lot of Zooms. Don't go straight to the task. Like one that I like that really works, I just posted this on LinkedIn and people have been loving it, is just what recent event gave you joy? You start the meeting and you just ask people to share what's a moment that just recently gave you joy. And people will share very personal things very quickly, you'll notice. There's also a lot of research that supports that if you want to manage difficult conversations, you have to learn how to open up the conversation with questions. So you might ask, how do you see this situation? Or what's your perspective on this? My point is this: when you ask open-ended questions, when you flip the questions you ask, you naturally put yourself in a position of discovery. That's the second part of the model. The third part of the model is about the power of compliments. And you'll notice here that I propose that when we compliment, we have the ability to affect people and their sense of self, their identity. We have the ability to impact people not just in the present moment, but also in the future, because our communication affects people. So one of the key words, and this is basically me summarizing decades of research in the field of communication into one word, is if I had to tell you, what do we know? We know that communication affects people. You know, I think about that often as a father. I have 3 young kids. I'm like, my communication is going to affect how my children grow and develop. My communication affects my marriage. My communication affects my students. My communication affects the people I work with. So complimenting is a behavior that's critical for me, not as a way of controlling people, because sometimes I get this question. Managers will ask me, hey, Julien, how many times should I compliment my team to get them to do what I want? Yeah, that's not at all what we're talking about here. I'm talking about if you know that your communication affects people, you can take responsibility and choose to bring out the strength you see in others. That's a very different kind of impulse. So take a moment here, and I'm going to ask you to share in the chat. Take a moment to reflect about this question. What is the best or one of the best compliments that you have received? Take a minute here to put yourself back in that situation. And when you're ready, try to put it in the chat. I'm going to give you just a quick minute here. Keep you on track. And so let me be more precise. Once you have the moment, all I want you to do is put the words the person said to you. You don't have to give us the whole story. Just put down what the person said. I don't want to see it. Somebody says, enthusiasm, you have shined. You care when the situation gets tough. You smile makes me, we're lucky to have you on board. Thank you for speaking with us. Your work is meaningful. You are a star. Your smile makes me happy. We missed your presence. You have made a difference since joining. You have a warm character. You're very insightful. You can see, we can all take this little moment and think, hey, someone said something. That's my 1 minute timer. Someone said something to me that impacted me, right? And we'll let it keep on. You know, there's even some in French. I love it. You're a star. Vous êtes une guerrière. Thanks for helping me to figure out a better way, right? So we've got all these moments. And I know when we look at our own lives that a lot of these moments happen in the workplace. Like, here's one of mine. When I was a young assistant professor here, I came to the university, I was 26 years old, and I joined the department, and I had been here for a couple of years. And at some point, I had met the provost of the university. The provost is the chief academic officer of the institution. His name was David Belcher. Here I am one Friday afternoon trying to work my way through tenure and promotion, and I'm working on an article or something like that, and I get a phone call out of the blue on a late Friday afternoon. I pick up the phone. On the other end of the line is David Belcher. He says, "Hi, Julien. This is David Belcher. And I'm giving you a call because, as you know, I'm leaving the university. So David was leaving UA Little Rock to become chancellor in, I think it's Western Carolina University. And he says, I'm leaving here in a couple months, but I wanted to call you personally as I'm making a few key phone calls around campus to let you know how great of a job you're doing here as a faculty and a teacher and an educator and a researcher. And I can't wait to see the great contributions you're going to make to this university in the next 10 years, because you're going to become a fantastic leader for this institution. You know, what a great moment to get that conversation from the chief academic officer of your institution. David Belcher was so loved here at UA Little Rock, and in fact, became so loved at Western Carolina University, one of the most beloved chancellors of the institution. Sadly, a couple years ago, he passed away from a tumor, a brain tumor. But if you Google his name right now, you'll notice that the institution that he led for 10 years still has a website dedicated to his leadership. And that's because David Belcher, as a leader, would say, let me use some of my energy to let people know what I see in them. That's what I want you to see, is that it's not about controlling interaction. It's David Belcher intentionally used his time to make a few phone calls to tell people, here's what I see in you. Here's what I see in you. That's the move I want you to make. And we know it matters in the workplace a great deal. Consider these facts. The most compelling determiner of an employee's performance is the quality of the relationship that they have with their immediate supervisor. When that relationship is strong, people do extraordinary things in terms of performance. Look at the second claim. Recognition, this is all backed by research. Recognition for a job well done, respectful treatment, and coaching and feedback are considered more important than pay by employees across the board. The message from these studies is clear. This is a review of literature of like decades of research in this area. Focusing on strength improves employee performance, whereas focusing on weaknesses undermines performance. So if you're constantly giving people feedback about what they're not doing at all or what they need to improve, you're actually undermining their performance. If you're building on their strength, you're accelerating their performance. So lots of things to think about, obviously, but I want to give you something practical you can do today. So here's a few things you can work on. You know, here's an easy one. Intentionally deliver compliments to 3 people. You know, we're going to be a little tight on time here, so I'm going to ask you to do this on your own. After this talk, you have to reach out to 3 new people, 3 stakeholders in the organization, and connect with them. And you have to think of 3 people that you work with. And for each person, I would like you to think of their strength and then develop a compliment and then deliver that compliment. Now, the most powerful way of delivering compliment, the research shows, is one-on-one. So if you really want to make it meaningful, you go to the person, you say, you know, I've been thinking of you, and I want to let you know you're doing such unbelievable work for us here, and I couldn't do any of what I'm doing without you. If you want to make it a little bit less meaningful, a little bit more safe for you, you can write a powerful thank you note, because people can actually hang on to the note and reread it, which is very good. You can also use some space in meetings to celebrate people. But try to do this. I was blown away. I did a training a month ago for actually the Arkansas Department of Transportation, huge organization here. And in the training, they have like a really fantastic culture. And I couldn't quite point my finger on it. So I did a bit of a survey with them to see where they were at, why they had such a strong culture. Well, one of the questions was, have you been praised in the last 7 days by someone on your team or one of your supervisor? And I couldn't believe it. I was floored. I didn't even know what to do in the training. 96% of people said yes. I had never seen something so high. You want to impact culture, you got to start expressing the strength that you see in each other. Second behavior is email your team right now. Celebrate them. Tell them how great of a job they're doing. Take these little moments. And then I read this in a book the other day I really liked on community building. And he says, we've got to learn to focus on gifts rather than deficiencies. And that's kind of a shift perspective. So when you compliment, you have the ability to affect who people are as well as who they become. That's the third part of the model. The fourth part of the model is about the power of disclosure. Here I propose that when we disclose, we have the ability to deepen the relationships that we have with other people. So a couple years ago, I was doing this interview for the book I've mentioned a couple times now, and it's called How Communication Scholars Think and Act. And one of those interviewees was Valerie Manusov. She's a communication professor at the University of Washington. And this interview was really powerful. So I have to set up the context. Think about it this way. This person has been teaching, researching, engaging in communication research her whole life. And this is what she said to me. She said, you know, Julien, I never knew the extent to which my own fear was coming across as not being open or as being reticent. And that is not a very engaging way to be. She said to me, you know, I realized like I had lost friendships because I was not willing to connect. I had lost romantic relationships because I was not willing to connect. I was not able to maintain great connections at work because I was not willing and able to share who I am in an authentic and genuine way. And so she said, she went through this transformative journey and she said, you know what, I'm going to now use this opportunity when I meet with people to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to go on this journey of becoming more and more open. So for me, this part of the model is not a one-time thing. I think of it kind of as a journey. Go in the direction of opening up, of finding, of meeting. We call this kind of congruence, which is meeting what's on the inside of you with what's on the outside of you. When these two things are together, you're congruent, you're emotionally honest. When there's a divergence, right, there's a bit of chaos, a bit of discord. In my field, we know that not all forms of disclosure create that purpose. It needs to have a couple elements. So I've put those on the slides here. You've got, in order to deepen relationships, you have to be authentic. You have to be genuine. I never want people to feel like we're supposed to pretend somehow in these interactions. We're not. We're trying to do our best to communicate in a positive way. Other elements include being truthful and honest, right? So being truthful is going to get people to understand the situation much more effectively. It's also about tapping into the experience of humanness and personalness. So the more you can have these elements in what you're doing and what you're saying, then the more people are going to connect with you, the more the relationship is going to deepen. Lots of examples for how to talk about this, but today I wanted you to feel it and just do it with me because, you know, we're in a webinar. I'm not even seeing you right now, quite honestly, and I wish I could, but we're going to do one little experiment to try to practice it. So here it is. It's called the gratitude. I've called this the gratitude text challenge. Here's what I want you, because I know you're dying to use your phone anyways. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your phone and think of someone for whom you're grateful. My only request now is it can't be your mom. I got to make it a little bit more challenging. Think of somebody at work. And then I'd like you to use your phone and send them a text. And while this is happening, you can pay attention to your emotions too. So I'm going to give you 2-3 minutes here to just send a text of gratitude to someone in your life. We'll do it together. I'm going to do it too. Once you've drafted it, hopefully you've pressed send. I want you to pay attention to that feeling. You know, sometimes we're like, oh, look at that. Somebody said, we did it. Awesome. It was a bit hard. Yeah, sometimes you have this little bit of a reticence. You're like, what am I doing, right? Why would we resist doing something so good? It's so interesting to me. Just as a fun story, I've done this with a lot of groups. I did it one time in person with 300 people in the room. So we all did our messages of gratitude. And at some point, somebody raised their hands like, oh, I got an answer, I got an answer. So we all turned to that one person who said, what did they say? And she said, who the hell is this? And so, you know, I am not saying this will always work for you, but it can be an opening. Remember, when we do positive communication, we're opening ourselves, we're extending a hand. Here's a nice quote for you. This is from Hugh Prather, who wrote a nice little book called My Struggle to Become a Person. And he says this in the book. He says, I must do these things in order to communicate. I need to become aware of you, and that is discover you. I need you to make you aware of me, that is uncover myself, or that's disclosure. But I also need to be ready to change during our conversation, and I need to be willing to reveal my changes to you, which is also disclosure. That's the fourth part of the model. I see some chats coming up. I'm so glad that you're getting some responses. Sometimes people also get the one like, is everything okay? Which signals so much about the relationship, right? That it's so not happening that people are like, what's wrong? That's their first instinct. So something to think about. All right. The fifth part of the model is, for me, it's really thinking about, you can see the icon there. It's thinking about communication as a gift. And for me, communication is just as tangible as giving money or giving time. Communication is an act of giving. And if you think about it, you'll know that it's true. We use communication to give affection. Nonverbal, right? We hug, we touch, we hold each other, we say kindness. We use communication to give love. And we use communication in a very powerful way to give each other social support, especially during hard times. So this part of the model is really about, what do we do when we have a hardship? And maybe it's a crisis in the organization, or maybe it's a tough time, like we've all had to deal with COVID-19, right? Or maybe there's something very challenging that you're managing, a project that's taking a toll. And the behavior is encouraging, because when we encourage each other, we're literally giving each other the support that we need. So I wanted to give you a couple stories here to take this model. I like to do this. So here's a story. This comes from the book Way of the Peaceful Warrior, for those of you who want to read. It's a really nice book. And the story goes like this. It's very simple. It's the story of Dan, who is a college student, who has everything in the world to be happy, but he's not. In the middle of the night, he wakes up really in a dark space with deep depression, and he doesn't know what's going on. So one night, he goes on a run, and in the story meets a character named Socrates at a gas station. And the story unfolds with Socrates becoming Dan's mentor. But at one point in the story that I love, Socrates gets sick and tired of his mentee. So he tells Dan, he says, you know, Dan, you're really frustrating me here. You're just babbling your mouth, you're talking, you're not saying anything meaningful. Why don't you go sit on a rock for a while, and you can come back when you have something meaningful to say. So Dan quickly gets on a rock, but he comes right back and he's like, I've got this, Socrates. Love is all you need. Socrates points to the rock. He's like, go back to the rock. So Dan goes back to the rock and he tries to escape the exercise, right? He tries to escape it for a little bit. But at some point, he sits on the rock and he starts to ask himself, what value can I bring to my mentor? What can I tell him that would actually be meaningful? What is something that I can contribute to? And he comes up with nothing. So he sits on this rock all night long. But in the morning, something happens. He's looking across the horizon and he sees a couple. It's early in the morning, the sun is lifting, and all they're doing is they're kissing, and everything starts to slow down for him. So he rushes to Socrates and he says, Socrates, Socrates, I've got it, I've got it. There are no ordinary moments. Every moment we experience, we'll never be able to live it again, right? We have this one moment and it connects us and then it disappears. There are no ordinary moments. And I think that when we look at our lives, we can identify these little moments that feel like that. Like, here's some big ones. Years ago, I flew home. I had been home in a while, and I was raised in the French and Swiss Alps, so I love snow. And we were up in the mountains, and it had snowed all night. And I was there sitting on a mountain with my snowboard. And I promise you, there are no ordinary moments for Julien when he's about to dive down this powder with this view. Or we were coming back from that trip, and the beautiful city of Chicago suddenly out of nowhere became a desert of ice. You know, there are no ordinary moments when on a Sunday afternoon, I'm walking with my kid. This was a couple years ago. His name is Hugo, and he grabs a stick, and out of nowhere, he becomes a samurai. And there are no ordinary moments when your wife takes a little bit of her morning to cheer you up and give you a little bit of support. I've always told my students that when they get close to success, they should learn to ride the wave. I work with a lot of at-risk students, so when they get close to graduation, honestly, they panic. They're like, my parents have never done this. Who do I think? Why do I think I deserve this? They really start to kind of get edgy. So I teach them like, hey, cool down, get on the surfboard, and all you have to do is let the wave take you to success. Learn to ride the wave. Well, one year when I was chair of the department I mentioned earlier, this hostile workplace where people did not get along and I was supposed to try to change the culture, I would come home every night and I would talk to my wife and be like, how am I going to change this culture? How am I going to do it? What is going to be successful? And I was really struggling through this whole process, which makes sense now looking back. So one morning I got to the office and I got an email from my wife. And we never communicated in that way, so it really surprised me. So I opened the email, and in big, bold letters, she wrote down, ride the wave, baby. And then she attached this picture. If you can't see, it's a picture of Photoshop. I've been Photoshopped on a real surfer here. So there's no ordinary moments when your wife takes a little bit of her morning to Photoshop a picture of you on a real surfer to boost yourself, right? And that's the power of communication. And the truth of the matter is, there are no ordinary moments for the work that you do. You know, I visited the website a couple of days ago, and there was this really great story about actually an 8-year-old being married, and I couldn't help myself but give to the organization. The work you do around the world is so critical. And all of those pieces, everybody here in this space together, there are no ordinary moments to make that kind of positive change. And we know that communication works in this way. So I want to show you a quick video here. Let me come back out. I have to reset it to share the sound. But I've been doing this research where we essentially interview people. We sit them down in a room and I ask them, tell me a story about a time when you had a conversation with someone that brought you great joy or that brought you great happiness. By the way, recent finding from that research shows that 97.5% of hundreds of stories that I've analyzed and collected use the behaviors of the model that I'm teaching, meaning 97.5% of the stories have one of the behaviors reflected that you're learning about today. But here's the story of LaShonda. Listen to her peak moment. Here it is.
And so I didn't really consider college, one, because we were so poor, and I was like, well, how am I going to pay for that? Mm-hmm. So our college night, I had a recruiter come, and he was like, well, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I never really thought about it because I didn't think about, my goal was like to finish high school successfully. So, and I was like, well, I don't think I'm college material unless I get a scholarship, and it would have to be an athletic scholarship. So softball or volleyball or even band, because I was a band geek, like 6th grade through 12th grade. And he told me, he said that, and he was like, he seriously looked at me and was like, you can be anything you want to be. He was like, this school is offering you a chance to go to school. You may not be able to start at, because I was worried I was going to start remedial courses, and he was like, you don't know that. You don't know that until you try. And from that, and I applied, I got accepted, and he followed me throughout my my first 2 years in college, just that voice of encouragement. And he told me when I transferred, I left Bethel because they really didn't have my program. And he was like, be confident, be strong, be resilient. And those are like my foundation. I am probably the most resilient person you've ever met. Like, it's so hard for me to give up on anything that I start. And I built myself up on his words. So I'm trying not to cry now because they were so strong and they were so powerful. And when you don't come from a family that has a huge education background, you don't feel like you can do that because it's not what you see every day. So I seriously built my life on those three what adjectives?
You know, what a small moment in the scheme of a person's life. It's be confident, be strong, be resilient. But she says, I built my life upon these words. I'm the most resilient person. Encouraging is really a key way that we provide the social support that we need to really overcome hardship. So what can you do? I told you I would make it very practical every time. So what can you do here? How can you transform ordinary moments into extraordinary ones? It's actually really simple. The research shows that there's 3 ways of doing that. One is give meaningful advice. When we interview people about memorable conversations, 60% of them are words of advice that they received from a boss. If you're in a leadership role, use the knowledge you have, the expertise, care about your employees to give meaningful, off-the-record advice that may help them in some way. Those really stick with people. Find ways of alleviating distress. In other words, talk to people, see what kind of stress they're experiencing, and then find ways of alleviating that. And then when people have a hardship, it's really important to help them refocus on their strength, right? When they lose a little bit of confidence, when they lose a little self-esteem, you want to remind people of the strengths that they have. 3 easy ways of using communication as a gift. So now we reach the last piece of the model, which is the 6th behavior. In it, I propose that when we listen deeply, authentically to one another, that we have the ability to transcend the perceived differences that exist between us and other people. Listening deeply is obviously something very difficult, and I'm going to try to give you just one little strategy today, okay? I know I can't see you, but maybe Leanne and everybody that I can see can join me. Here's what I'd like you to do. Take your right hand and make a really tight fist. And imagine that this is you about to have a very frustrating encounter. Maybe you're in a meeting where the conversation is going in a direction you don't want it to go, or you're having a hard talk with somebody. So you feel frustrated. Notice that when we have a conflict, we get tight, just like this hand. Now, all I want you to do is take this hand, point it facing up, and slowly open the hand. Oh, doesn't that feel good? Slowly opening the hand. This, my friends, is the whole story of listening. In order to listen, we have to open our hands. Researchers know that in order to listen deeply to one another, we have to be able to do a couple things. We have to cultivate in us the ability to be open to new ideas, thoughts, expressions, even if we might disagree with them. We have to learn to withhold our judgment in our evaluations. This comes from the famous psychologist Carl Rogers, who called it unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard. Regard is the way I look at you, comes from the French regarder. Positive is warmth. Unconditional is without any conditions. So if I approach interaction without any conditions, with warmth, then I set up a whole new different context. The third is empathy, is imagining the world of others. And the fourth, which is really important, is giving people attention, right? And that can be as simple as squaring our shoulders or leaning in. Research shows that just the act of leaning it actually triggers your brain for better listening. But our eyes also matter. Here's a quick story. I'll just share very quickly. His story comes from the book Have a Little Faith by Mitch Albom. And it's a sermon from a rabbi, but the sermon goes like this. It's a little girl coming home to her mom, and she's like, hey, mom, look, I've painted this drawing. It looks really good, but the mom is busy. She's just tending to the pots. She's cooking dinner. You know, she's having, like, I have 3 kids. I know what it's like, rough evening. So, but the daughter is like, okay, she's like, oh, it looks great, honey. She just sadly looks at it. And then the daughter's like, Mom, look at my drawing. I'm so proud of it. I've worked on it all day. And she's like, it looks great, honey. And she's still tending to the pots. So the daughter gets mad. She says, Mom, you're not listening to me. And she says, of course I'm listening to you. No, you're not. You're not listening to me with your eyes. Listening, deep listening involves all of those characteristics. I mentioned Arvid Singo earlier, and I interviewed him mostly because he's a fantastic professor. He travels around the world, and he really works with communities. So he's the guy who travels to Africa and help with a village with AIDS, or he goes to Thailand and talks to people about malnutrition. So he's very active in kind of community development work. And he says, when I was young, I would go into meetings that were difficult, and I had two ways of responding. I had the fight response and I had the flight response. I would either fight my way through the interaction, argue, make claims, support it with evidence, or I would just shy away and withdraw. But he says, with experience, I learned a third way. This is what he said. I love it. He says, today, Julien, I make that effort to listen and to truly listen and to shut up what's going on inside of me. I tell myself, just shut up, Arvind. Just let it happen. Embrace the lessons. And I love the phrase, lean into the discomfort. Don't fight it. Lean into it if you can and be vulnerable for a moment, because then you're fully present. So my very practical advice for you is this. If you get in a tight situation and the interaction is not going so well, take your right hand and I put it underneath the desk if I'm at a meeting, and I just slightly physically will open my hand. I'll tell myself, just lean in a little bit, become curious. And he said the third way changed his interactions because he was not tight anymore. He was curious. And that changed the way he responded to what was happening. All right, we're coming to the end so we can have some questions and answers here. In this short talk, what I've tried to do is illustrate that if you practice positive communication, it's going to help you grow as a professional, grow and develop. I'm not saying it's easy. I just think it's part of our development as leaders. It's going to help you create high quality connections. I just mentioned it earlier, 97.5% of moments where people experience joy and happiness or positive emotion are connected to the behaviors I've just described in this talk. And hopefully it will help you create and build a positive culture for an agency that does so much important work around the world. My proposition is for you to put into practice this simple model. I believe that if you greet people, you can create connection. I believe that when you ask open-ended questions, you can discover the unknown. I believe that when you compliment, you get to affect people, both who they are in the moment and who they become. I believe that when you disclose genuinely and authentically, maybe take a little moment to express gratitude, you can deepen the relationships that you have with others. I believe that when you encourage, you can give people the support they need. And that when you listen deeply, you can transcend the perceived differences between you and other people. And when you do that, you're going to create a revolution in who you are, a revolution in your relationships at home and at work, and a revolution in the workplace in which you spend a lot of time and hopefully make a difference. George Vaillant is right. The only thing that matters in life are the relationships that you have with other people. But what I've tried to show you in the talk is that you cannot have relationships without communication. And if you change your communication, you will automatically change those relationships. So on that journey, I wish you the very, very best, but just know meanwhile that I see the light in you. Namaste, and thank you so much for joining this workshop with me this morning.
Oh my goodness, Julien. There were so many wonderful comments in the chat box, which we'll make sure to share with you. I want to say that that's one of the most impactful, relevant, and meaningful talks that I've ever attended in my UN career. It's truly, truly wonderful. And so you've given us homework and lessons, and I'm excited to try them out. And while I've been committed to the pursuit of a positive organization for many years, I'm still learning. I learned so much from you today. So I'd like to open the floor to our colleagues for your comments and questions. Karen will open your camera. If you raise a hand, or if you want to make a comment in the chat box, we'll monitor that and read it out. Karen, can you see the raised hands?
I do not see any raised hands yet, but on the Q&A box, there are 2 questions, anonymous, that I shared with Julien.
Great. And I can maybe start with those, and hopefully, and first of all, thank you so much for having me, and Leanne, for your kind comments, and the rest. There's a lot of chats happening, so I'm trying not to get too distracted here. So thank you so much, everybody, for the positive feedback. Let me take the first question. It's a good one. How do you deal with people who get adversarial once you communicate in a truthful, honest way with them? Some people live in denial all the time. So, you know, a lot of what I focus today, I'm going to answer the question. The first thing I'm going to say is the only thing you can control, is very important, is your communication. And a lot of what I focus today is focusing, making your energy about what you do and not the energy about what other people are doing. Now, I realize that that's very difficult to do when interactions get heated because we play off that one. So, so the reason I think about it in this way is because the ideal when somebody gets adversarial is to stick to the techniques that you know. And the techniques are using open questions. So if somebody's getting adversarial, the first impulse might be, so it looks like I may not be understanding where this frustration is coming from. Tell me more about your perspective so I can really understand you better. And that may start to shift, right? So I would go back to the technique. All of the techniques that we have for managing difficult conversations, they're all about this. I can just tell you very quickly. They're open questions. They're becoming more curious, and they're using strategies for creating that. So I'll give you, maybe I can share a quick story here. I use something called liberating structures. You can Google that. Maybe I can put it in the, let me see, I'll put it in the chat if I can. And you go to the website, Liberating Structures. They're short little tools that you can use when interactions are a little difficult. And one of my favorite is called Wimpy. And I did this with one of my employees when I was dean. She was director of development for me. And we were like both great people independently, but we couldn't really work well together. And so I could sense the relationship with kind of spiraling, partially because of our personalities. You know, I was an independent hard worker. She was an independent hard worker. So we had a hard time coming together. But we had been good friends. So it was kind of sad, and I could see it spiraling out. So she said, hey, let's have a retreat together. And so I said, okay, great. You plan the retreat and I'll take care of the icebreaker. And I use a technique called Wimpy. Wimpy means what I need from you. And I'm telling you, it changed our relationship. So she was my director of development, and we wanted to raise funds for the college, which I love doing. And we were not doing it very well. We had the retreat, and the exercise is simple. I just said, take 5 minutes to answer the statements, what I need from you. Choose the top 2, and then I'll do the same. So we wrote it down, like I broke down the interaction, and we just wrote down what I need from you. And then we shared. So I listened to her, and she said, you know, what I really need from you is for you to trust me. I'm really good at development. She said, and sometimes I may make decisions, but I need you to trust those decisions and be a team with me. And then my need was I needed her to include me. I wanted to meet people, and I wanted to build good relationships with our donors right away so I could cultivate those relationships. So I say, I really need you to include me. It was the first time where we really heard each other. You see, none of it was conflictual because it was expressing our needs. And then we started meeting each other's needs, and we became like a fantastic team. We played in tennis tournaments together, or we became really deep friends. And in 3 years, we raised $3 million for the college when the average was $30,000 a year. So I'm only giving you this example because sometimes you need a technique to help you get out of the adversarial context. And the liberating structure was one way to get at that. I hope that answers it for the anonymous question here. Okay, with some people, even if we listen deeply, they do not. That's true. I've had that situation where I have shared messages of deep gratitude, but those were met with just thank you or smiling. How to communicate with such people? So, you know, again, I'm going to return to this idea that it's very hard, but you have to learn that what you're doing as a positive communicator is acting with integrity, and other people are going to have to do their own work. So I would try to maybe, like, you know, There's clear breaking of expectations. So I might decrease the expectations a little bit. Some people may say thank you in a very brief way, but it may really resonate with them deeply. It's hard to tell. I'll use a metaphor here. As a teacher, I always felt like classes where students were super engaged and talking and interacting with me, that they were learning more. And one year I tested it and I found I had 2 classes. And I found that the class that was like super quiet, I didn't seem to be able to break through. They were like learning the best. Like they were outperforming the class that was not. So I would say, learn to practice the moves, believe in them, and give the time to bring that connection. We have to understand that creating meaningful relationships with people is not a one-time shot, right? Like we practice complimenting. You may go give 3 compliments to people. That's going to have an impact. But remember that it's a weekly kind of thing. It has to be consistent in order to create that relationship. I hope that helps. Let me see. I've got a couple. Somebody asked, is communication a talent or a competency? I see it very much as a competency because I think of it as an art. And for me, an art form is you have to learn practice, you have to learn techniques, you have to learn theory. And those things will make you stronger in that behavior. If you give me 2 days with people, I can make you a great public speaker. So for me, communication competency is something that's learned and not just given. So how do you communicate with a person that you don't trust and don't say good morning, but yet need to collaborate with? Yeah, that's a great question. So if you want, because people have to work together, you may have to do something like what I've described with Winfrey. If you care about the relation, in my experience, like the workplace where people did not get along, they hated it. Like actually they were in pain and they were suffering because they couldn't come to work. They couldn't have joy. They couldn't share anything with one another. So they were in a pretty dark place, kind of like a depression, but just at the organizational level. So in order to change that, you have to start re-inviting connection. Trust is fragile, but the way to build it is through communication. So you have to reset a little bit and you have to be able to say, let me connect with this person a little bit more. It's like counterintuitive, right? Because your movement is like, let me move away, but try to get connected with the person. And maybe if you really want to, then you can use Winfrey, or you can try to ask some question, discover the person, and see if you can start seeing the strength in them that they bring and expressing this. So I would start practicing the model and I would start to go at work that way. And I think you may see the relationship transform. What's great about communication is that, and what's great about relationships is that they're never one thing. They're not a stable entity. Relationships are a dynamic process, always. And so we're never going to get to this place where it's done. We have to work all the time at them. Okay, let me see here. Okay, how do you ask open-ended questions and get quick resolution? When confrontation starts, will you be able to get issues resolved quickly by being open as real concerns remain unresolved for longer? So it's a great question. I do not want to pretend today that you can solve a tough encounter with just one open-ended question. That's not realistic, Relationships, as I just said, they take time. And so it may mean multiple meanings to work through it. Relationships have ebbs and flows. They're not perfect. We can't just be excellent all the time. So there's going to be ebbs and flows, ups and downs, and they're part of relating. So what I want you to do is start to draw on these behaviors to change the relating process and not think about the outcome, right? Because we want a resolution, we want it done. But really, if you want to change the relationship and get something better, you've got to engage in a process in a longer term perspective. Is that kind of making sense? It's hard because I'm not getting feedback from people, but something to think about. I think that's it that I see in the Q&A. I think we're pretty close to time. So if there's something else, I'm happy to. Okay, here's one last one. What can you say about those who are not perfect in communication? I would say the same thing to all of us. None of us are perfect communicators. I have studied this my whole life. I told you my whole adult life. I know theories most people don't know. I do research in this area, and I still come home and struggle, And so I think what's cool about positive communication is this. Also, you need to build empathy. So it is hard moving in the direction of other people. It is hard seeing the strength when things are difficult. It is hard flipping questions. So for me, you have to have both the empathy, like, oh man, this is something difficult. And that gives us the ability to say to other people, man, you must be struggling too. And we're struggling together, but let's do the best we can. I hope that helps with some of your questions. Wonderful questions. Thank you so very much.
Julien, incredibly helpful. I think if I want to give a theme to your talk today, is the theme is hope.
Yeah.
And many of the people I've met with about 300 of our personnel over the past almost 3 years on issues related to interpersonal conduct. And a lot of them feel very stuck. Yeah. They're really stressed and they feel helpless. And what you've given us today is, tangible, practical things that we can do to shift the dial on some of our relationships. I do want to make a special call to our personnel to make use of our ombudsman and mediation services. This kind of work is tricky, but you're not alone. And I do encourage you to reach out to that office. And with that, I just want to once again give my heartfelt thanks. It was truly wonderful and inspiring. And we're looking forward to having you back again for some of our staff in the regions who couldn't attend today because of the time difference. And thank you everyone for attending. It was really well attended and wonderful questions and more to come.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Thank you very much,
Julien.
everybody. Bye.
Bye, colleagues.